You think your body is yours. You look down at your hand, look in the mirror, and you believe that thing is you, an independent existing entity. It's not. It's completely wrong if you look at it through physics. The iron in your blood was not made inside your body. It was born in a supernova explosion more than 1 billion years ago, long before Earth even existed. The carbon in your skin is not yours. It used to be carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It used to be in trees. It used to belong to creatures that died a very long time ago. You don't own a single atom in your body, not one. You're only holding together about 7 times 10 to the 27th atoms for a short period of time through chemistry and a constantly working biological system. And this is the moment when everyone says, we are stardust, and thinks they've understood something profound. But that's not the important part. Yet the important part is what happens when this structure starts to come apart, when the bonds holding you together stop working. What does it more thoroughly, without leaving the original structure behind? A fire at temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius that breaks every bond in a few hours, or trillions of bacteria quietly breaking you down, step by step, until nothing remains intact. And we're not going to talk about the soul or beliefs. We're going to talk about physics, chemistry, and biology, things that can be measured and verified. This is not philosophy. This is a problem with data. So before we talk about breaking you apart, we have to clearly understand one simpler thing, what you really are. If you take an average human body weighing about 70 kilograms and analyze it by mass, you'll find about 43 kilograms is oxygen, 16 kilograms is carbon, 7 kilograms is hydrogen, and nearly 2 kilograms is nitrogen, with the rest being trace elements in very small proportions. But if you switch to looking at it by the number of atoms, the picture changes completely, because about 60% of the atoms in you are hydrogen, about 26% are oxygen, and the rest are carbon, along with some other elements. That means most of what you call your body is actually just light atoms bonded together in temporary structures. About 60% of your body's mass is water, and that means you are not a solid, stable object, but a biological solution system that is constantly exchanging matter and energy with the surrounding environment. The rest, the part that gives you shape and function, is built primarily on carbon, because carbon has the ability to form complex chains and networks from proteins to lipids and DNA. In each of your cells, the DNA contains about 3.2 billion base pairs, and all the information about your body is encoded in that structure. But all of these things, from proteins to DNA, are not permanent solid blocks. They only exist because covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds are holding them together at every moment. If you break those bonds, the structure disappears, and what remains is just scattered atoms. So what can break those bonds? What can take a living, soft, organized structure with memory, with metabolism, and turn it back into matter that no longer carries its original form? In reality, there are 2 major pathways to do this, and they differ almost completely in principle. The first pathway is fire, or more precisely, thermal energy, large enough to exceed the stability threshold of chemical bonds. When a body is placed in an environment with very high temperature, the atoms in proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids begin to vibrate more violently, faster and stronger, until that vibrational energy exceeds the level that covalent bonds can hold. When that happens, the structure is no longer stable. Proteins are no longer proteins. Lipids are no longer cell membranes. DNA is no longer a chain of information. Instead, everything begins to collapse into smaller molecules, and then continues to be oxidized into gas. That is why a cremation furnace, operating at temperatures of about 760 to 1150 degrees Celsius, can disassemble most of the body very quickly. It's not because the fire is smart, but because heat is a very universal form of violence in chemistry. It doesn't need to know what is a liver cell, what is collagen, or what is DNA. It only needs to pump enough energy into the system, and the system will collapse on its own. But the second pathway is not like that. Bacteria do not destroy the body by throwing energy at every bond at once. Bacteria work much more slowly, much more selectively, and if we want to be precise, much more sophisticatedly. They secrete enzymes, and enzymes are chemical tools with astonishing precision. A protease enzyme recognizes protein and cuts it into smaller peptides. A lipase attacks fats, breaking triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. Nucleases cut DNA and RNA into small fragments until the information once encoded in them no longer exists as a structure. Here there is no energy explosion, no strong blow from the outside, but rather a disassembly piece by piece, layer by layer, step by step, according to the logic of biochemistry. And that makes bacteria a completely different kind of force. Fire comes from the outside. It is applied to the body like an event. Bacteria were already there beforehand. While you were alive, you carried tens of trillions of bacteria inside you, especially in the gut, on the skin, and in the oral cavity. They are not invaders that arrived later. They are long-term residents of the system. While you were alive, the immune system, blood circulation, oxygen levels, temperature, pH, all of those things maintained a certain order and made the relationship between you and them symbiotic, or at least controlled. But when life stops, when circulation ceases, when oxygen runs out, when immunity disappears, then that same microbial system immediately changes roles. They don't need to break down the door to get in. They were already inside the house. They simply begin to eat what was previously forbidden. And that is the deepest difference between these two mechanisms. Fire is an exogenous force. Bacteria are an endogenous process. Fire imposes decomposition from the outside in. Bacteria initiate decomposition from the inside out. One is like using a sledgehammer to smash down a building. The other is like unscrewing each screw, cutting each wire, and disconnecting each joint until the entire structure collapses on its own. And when you look at it that way, you begin to see why our question cannot be just about speed. Yes, fire is very fast. It can do most of the work in a few hours. Bacteria are much slower. They need days, weeks, months, sometimes years. But speed and completeness are not the same thing. You can break a system extremely quickly and still leave most of the material in a form that hasn't truly returned to the biological cycle. You can also break it more slowly, but more thoroughly, not only making it disappear in form, but also returning each of its elements back to the chemical network of soil, water, air, and life. And that is why we have to be careful with how we phrase the question. If you ask what is faster, the answer can be simple, but if you ask what breaks down the body more completely, meaning not only making it lose its shape, but also disassembling its chemical structure in the deepest way, redistributing its material most thoroughly, then you are forced to compare these two mechanisms on multiple criteria at once. We have to ask how fire handles protein and how bacteria handle protein. We have to ask what happens to carbon, to hydrogen, to nitrogen, to calcium in each case. We have to ask what disappears, what remains, what gets locked away in ash, in bones, in soil, in the atmosphere. In short, this is no longer a question of which is stronger, but a question of which goes all the way to the end. When you put a body into the cremation process, you are not just burning it in the ordinary sense. You are placing it into a tightly controlled environment, with temperatures typically ranging from 760 to 1,150 degrees Celsius, according to operating standards in the United States. At that temperature level, you are entering a zone where chemistry no longer proceeds in the familiar slow way. Reactions begin to accelerate extremely. Molecules don't just vibrate. They oscillate with enough energy to overcome bonding barriers. And when that happens, chemical bonds don't weaken gradually. They are broken almost instantly. Proteins, which are held together by peptide bonds, are denatured and then decompose. Cell membranes are destroyed. DNA, the structure that once stored your information, is broken into short segments and then further decomposed into simpler molecules. And when oxygen is present, which almost always happens in a cremation environment, oxidation reactions dominate. Carbon, which makes up about 16 kilograms in an average body, begins to combine with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. And this process does not happen slowly over many days or hours, but occurs continuously, powerfully, and most of that carbon leaves the body in gaseous form within a few hours. Hydrogen, the element making up about 7 kilograms, also does not stay. It combines with oxygen to form water, but not liquid water, but water vapor at high temperature. This vapor quickly escapes and joins the atmosphere, eventually becoming part of the global water cycle. Nitrogen, oxygen, and other elements are also released in gaseous form, or gaseous compounds, depending on the specific reaction conditions. If you look at the entire process from the perspective of mass, you will see one thing very clearly. About 95% of the body's mass is converted into gas within 2 to 3 hours. This figure is not an estimate. It is documented in the technical literature of organizations such as the Cremation Association of North America, which standardizes operating conditions and tracks the results of millions of cremations. That means most of what you call your body, the organic part, the part that once participated in metabolism, in thought, in biological activity, disappears from the solid structure almost completely in a very short period of time. If you only look at speed, this is an almost perfect process. There is no significant delay, no stage that lasts for months or years, no heavy dependence on environmental conditions, such as humidity or microorganisms. You input energy, and the system collapses. But precisely because it works that way, you also begin to see an important feature. Fire does not choose what to destroy. It destroys everything that can react at that temperature, and it does so by pushing matter out of its structured state and into a gaseous state. This is a phase transition process combined with chemical reactions where matter does not disappear but only leaves its original form and disperses into the environment. Carbon is no longer in you, but it still exists as carbon dioxide in the air. Hydrogen is no longer in the cells, but it exists as water vapor. In other words, fire does not erase matter, it releases it extremely quickly. And if we stop here, you might think this is the most efficient way to break down a body, because nearly the entire organic portion has been processed in a few hours. But our question is not only whether it is fast or not, but whether it is complete or not. And to answer that, we need to look more closely at what fire actually leaves behind. After most of the soft tissue has been burned and released into the atmosphere, there is still something that does not disappear so easily, and that is the skeleton. The main component of bones is not organic molecules that are easily oxidized like proteins or fats, but a very durable mineral network, primarily calcium phosphate in the form of hydroxyapatite. This mineral network reacts to heat in a very different way. The temperature of the cremation furnace is enough to evaporate water, destroy collagen, burn soft tissue, and erase most of the organic traces of the body. But it does not make the entire mineral portion disappear into the air. It dries the bones, makes them brittle, causes them to crack and break, and removes their original biological structure. But it does not turn the bones into nothing. When the cremation process ends, what remains in the combustion chamber is not a fine dust as people often imagine, but brittle, white burned, easily broken bone fragments that are still bones in the material sense. These fragments are then placed into a mechanical device called a cremulator, basically an industrial grinder, where they are crushed into powder to create what the family receives and calls ashes. That means the ashes are not a direct and complete product of fire alone, but the product of fire plus a subsequent mechanical grinding step. And this detail is far more important than it appears, because it shows you that fire, by itself, does not complete the entire job. If you measure the mass of what remains, you will see that it is not small enough to ignore. For an adult body, the amount of ashes is usually between 2 and 3 kilograms, sometimes more, depending on body size, bone density, age, and gender. A person with a heavy, dense skeleton, rich in minerals, will leave behind more material than a person with thin or osteoporotic bones. In other words, although about 95% of the body's mass has left in gaseous form within 2 to 3 hours, about 5% of the material still exists in solid form. And that 5% is not a minor detail, because it reveals the real limit of fire. If you analyze the chemical composition of the ashes after cremation, you will see one thing very clearly. The ashes contain almost no carbon, no hydrogen, and almost no nitrogen, because these elements have been released during the oxidation process. Carbon has become carbon dioxide, hydrogen has become water vapor, nitrogen has left as nitrogen gas or nitrogen oxides. What remains is primarily calcium, phosphorus, along with some trace minerals such as potassium, sodium, magnesium, and other trace elements that were already present in the bones and mineralized tissues. That is, what remains is no longer the living part of you chemically. It is the inorganic part, the hard part, the part most resistant to heat for the longest time. This leads us to a somewhat counterintuitive conclusion. Fire is very effective at destroying the organic part of the body, but it does not completely destroy the entire material structure of the body. It separates the body into two different fates. Some atoms are pushed into the atmosphere almost immediately. Others are retained in a relatively stable solid mineral portion. And if there is no further processing, that portion can last a very long time. Think about that for a moment. If these ashes are placed in an urn and left on a fireplace mantle in a house in Ohio, Arizona, or California, the calcium and phosphorus in them do not return to nature right away. They do not participate in the biological cycle. They do not go into plant roots, into the soil, into water, or become part of the biosphere. They are kept in a static mineral form, almost biologically frozen. That means fire, although fast, is not necessarily complete in the sense we are pursuing. It dissolves the body's shape very quickly. It erases soft tissue very quickly. It makes the organic part disappear very quickly. But it does not send all the body's material to the same destination. One part of you is dispersed into the atmosphere that same afternoon, while another part may sit quietly in an urn for decades. And here you begin to see why our question cannot be only about speed. If you only ask what makes you disappear faster in front of human eyes, fire wins almost immediately. But if you ask what disassembles your body more completely, what not only destroys the shape, but also continues to process the remaining material until no part is kept outside the larger cycle of soil, water, air, and life, then fire begins to reveal its limits. It is like a tremendously powerful blow that collapses a building in just a few seconds, but still leaves a pile of concrete rubble lying there. The building is gone, yes, but the material has not been reintegrated into anything else. It is simply in a different state. That is the real limit of cremation. It is not wrong. It does not fail. It simply is not as complete as people often imagine. It does not erase the entire body into absolute absence. It only converts most of the body into gas and leaves the inorganic part behind as the final punctuation mark of the old structure. And precisely because of that, if we are serious about the question, what breaks down the body more completely, then we cannot stop here. We must look at the second pathway, the slower one, the less spectacular one, the one with less fire and less immediate sense of closure, but one that can go much further than fire in disassembling every part of the body all the way to the end. The path without flames, without a combustion chamber, without temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius, without a clear, bright moment that anyone can point to and say, that is when the body is destroyed. This path is much more discreet, much slower, but if you look at it through biology, instead of intuition, you will see that it begins long before you die, while you are still alive. Your body is not just a human body, it is an ecosystem. You carry within you about 38 trillion bacteria, and that number is large enough to completely ruin the way we usually imagine ourselves. You are not a pure block of human cells with a few bacteria clinging to the outside like dust on a jacket. No. You are a biological alliance, a multi-species system in which bacteria live in the gut, on the skin, in the mouth, in the nose, on mucous membranes, and most of the time they do not destroy you, they help you. They digest part of the food that your own enzymes cannot fully process. They produce some vitamins. They compete with disease-causing bacteria. They are part of the normal living state. But the important word here is normal, because that normal state only exists as long as the immune system, blood circulation, oxygen supply, temperature, pH and tissue barriers are still maintained. And as soon as that maintenance stops, the same microbial system that once cooperated with you begins to do a different job. When the heart stops beating, blood stops flowing. When blood stops flowing, oxygen is no longer delivered to the tissues. When oxygen runs out, the cells begin to lose their ability to maintain internal order. Ion pumps in the cell membranes stop working. The membranes become more permeable. Intracellular enzymes begin to leak. At the same time, the immune system, which consumes enormous energy to patrol and control every microbial threat, also stops working almost immediately. There are no more white blood cells chasing bacteria. There are no more inflammatory signals. There is no longer any line of defense keeping the microbial communities in their proper place. And that is when the process begins. Not after a few days, not when the body has completely cooled, but within a few hours. In many tissues, the first biochemical changes appear almost immediately after death, and bacteria immediately take advantage of that change. In particular, gut bacteria play a central role in this opening phase, because the gut is the place with the highest density of microorganisms in the body. While alive, the intestinal mucosa, protective mucus, immune cells, and the continuous movement of food keep the bacteria inside the gut lumen. But after death, the intestinal wall begins to lose its integrity very quickly. The tissues weaken, the biological barriers leak. Bacteria begin to cross the tissue layers and enter areas they were previously forbidden to access. The liver, pancreas, blood vessels, connective tissue, all gradually become new sources of nutrients. And here is something very noteworthy. They do not attack in the manner of war. They have no plan. They have no goal. They simply do what bacteria always do, which is to consume organic compounds to obtain energy and material for growth. But when the body is alive, that organic source is the food you eat. When the body is dead, that organic source is you yourself. Proteins in muscle tissue begin to be cut into smaller peptides by proteases. Lipids in cell membranes are broken down by lipases into glycerol and fatty acids. DNA and RNA are chopped by nucleases into nucleotides, and then further broken down into even smaller components. This does not happen like an explosion. It happens like an organized disassembly at the molecular level. One bond is cut, then another, and then the entire network of structures that once kept the cell alive begins to collapse. And because this process begins from the inside, it has a property that fire does not. It does not need to invade the body. It was already there. If fire is like a force applied from the outside in, bacteria are like a demolition crew that has been living inside the building from the start, only waiting for the security system to shut down to begin their work. That is why I emphasize that bacteria are not an external agent that appears after death. They are part of the condition of life, and death only changes their role. In life, they contribute to maintaining you. In death, they contribute to disassembling you. And that transition happens very quickly. Within a few hours, the first signs of autolysis and microbial decomposition begin to overlap. Autolysis is when the cell's own enzymes begin to digest the cell from the inside, because the membranes no longer hold them in place. Microbial decomposition is when bacteria take advantage of the new environment to spread and accelerate their metabolism. These two processes reinforce each other. Cells weaken, making it easier for bacteria to invade. Bacteria produce metabolic products, causing the tissues to deteriorate further. This is a feedback loop, and once it starts, it does not go back. So the second path officially opens, not through heat, not through immediate violence, but through trillions of small reactions happening simultaneously, in the darkness of soft tissue, in an oxygen-deprived environment, in a body that no longer has the ability to defend itself. And when that system has been switched on, when bacteria have escaped the limits that once kept them in a state of balance, the process enters a stage that you can clearly see with the naked eye, whether you want to or not. That is the stage of gas formation, one of the most characteristic and powerful stages of biological decomposition. In the oxygen-deprived environment I mentioned earlier, anaerobic bacteria begin to dominate, especially species that live in the gut, such as Clostridium and Bacteroides. organisms that were already accustomed to oxygen-free conditions. When they consume proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates in the tissues, they not only produce smaller molecules but also generate byproducts in the form of gases, including methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. Methane is a colorless, flammable gas, often associated with anaerobic fermentation. Carbon dioxide is a common product of respiration and organic breakdown. Hydrogen sulfide, which has the characteristic smell of rotten eggs, is the result of the decomposition of sulfur-containing compounds in proteins. These gases do not disappear immediately because they are produced inside a closed system, the body, where the tissues are still intact enough to hold them in for a period of time. And as the gases accumulate, the internal pressure begins to rise. This is when you see the phenomenon that forensic science calls the bloat stage, the swelling stage, which usually occurs about 2 to 5 days after death, depending on environmental temperature, humidity, and the presence of microorganisms. The body begins to swell, especially in the abdominal area, where bacterial density is highest. The soft tissues stretch. The skin may change color due to the accumulation of decomposition products. Blood vessels become visible under the skin due to the breakdown of hemoglobin. But the important thing is not the outward appearance, but what is happening at the molecular level. This is the stage where endogenous decomposition, that is, the disassembly from the inside, reaches its highest intensity. Bacteria do not just exist, they accelerate. Their numbers increase rapidly because of the abundant nutrient source and the lack of competition from the immune system. Enzymes continue to be secreted, cutting chemical bonds in proteins, lipids, and DNA. The tissues no longer hold their structure. The cells burst. The organs lose their shape. And all of this happens from the inside out. If you compare it with fire, where energy is applied from the outside and spreads inward, here you have a reverse process. The breakdown begins from the center, where bacteria are most densely concentrated, and then spreads to the peripheral areas. This has a very important consequence. It means that no part of the body is protected by its position. No outer layer can shield the inner layers, because the starting point lies right inside that structure. And as the gases continue to accumulate, the pressure can become great enough to rupture the weakened tissues, allowing oxygen from the outside to penetrate deeper. And when oxygen appears, aerobic bacteria and oxidation processes begin to participate, making the decomposition process more diverse in its mechanisms. But even before oxygen returns, this anaerobic stage has already performed an extremely important part of the work. It breaks complex chemical structures into simpler components, preparing for the next stages. And if you look at this from the perspective we have been pursuing, you will see a profound difference from fire. Fire breaks things down by putting in energy until the bonds can no longer hold. Bacteria break things down by cutting, separating, and metabolizing each bond, each molecule, each layer of structure, and they do it from inside the system. This is not an immediate destruction, but a continuous disassembly process where each reaction paves the way for the next. And in this gas stage, when the body swells due to the accumulation of metabolic products, you are seeing the physical manifestation of a series of biochemical reactions happening at a very high speed. A system once maintained by life is now disassembling itself under the guidance of organisms that were once part of it. This is not the end of the process, but its first peak, where most of the original structure has been broken down enough to move into a new stage, where the body is no longer a body, but has become an open source of nutrients for the outside world. When the gas pressure has weakened the structure from the inside, when the tissues begin to crack and allow the external environment to access deeper, a completely new stage begins, one no longer limited to the body, but open to the entire surrounding biological world. And here you see something very noteworthy. The body is not only being decomposed, it becomes an ecosystem. Even before you can recognize it, chemical signals have spread into the environment. Volatile compounds produced in the previous stage, especially molecules containing sulfur and nitrogen, disperse into the air and act as a kind of signal to other organisms. Flies, especially blowflies, can detect these compounds with astonishing sensitivity, and under favorable conditions, they can reach a body within just a few minutes after the first signs of decomposition appear. This is not a coincidence, but the result of millions of years of evolution, where these species have adapted to take advantage of exactly this type of environment as a nutrient source. When the flies arrive, they do not just stop by. They immediately begin their reproductive cycle. They lay eggs in moist, warm, nutrient-rich areas, usually natural orifices such as the mouth, nose, eyes, or areas of skin that have been damaged. Within a few hours to a day, the eggs hatch into larvae, and this is when the process accelerates in a completely different way. Fly larvae do not consume tissue in the way you imagine eating. They secrete enzymes to soften and break down the tissue first, then absorb the liquefied nutrients. Thousands, even tens of thousands of larvae can gather in one area, forming a continuously active biomass mass, and in just a few days, they can consume most of the soft tissue of the body. But flies are not the only creatures involved in this process. When you look more closely, you will see a complex community forming. Beetles arrive after the flies and consume other tissue parts, or even eat the larvae themselves. Ants, spiders, mites, and many other insect species participate in different ways. Fungi and bacteria from the soil invade the tissues and continue to break down what remains. Forensic studies have recorded that more than 100 different species of organisms can participate in the decomposition of a body under natural conditions, each species playing its own role, each acting at a specific stage, forming a nearly predictable succession. This means the body is no longer a single entity. It becomes an environment, a source of energy, a temporary ecosystem where matter and energy are transferred from one concentrated structure to dozens or hundreds of different living structures. Carbon that once lay in muscle now becomes part of a larva's body. Nitrogen that once lay in protein is now fed into the nitrogen cycle in the soil. Chemical energy that once maintained cellular activity is now redistributed to a diverse community of organisms. And if you look at this from the perspective we established from the beginning, you will see something very different from fire. Fire disperses matter very quickly, but it disperses it into a relatively simple environment, mainly the atmosphere. Here, bacteria and other organisms do not just break down the structure, they immediately reintegrate that matter into the biological network. There is no standing still stage like ashes sitting in an urn. No part is separated from the larger system. Everything is returned to the flow of life, piece by piece, molecule by molecule. And this makes this stage especially important for our question, because if the goal is to break down the body completely, not only making it disappear in form, but also redistributing all of its matter into other systems, then this is where you begin to see the clear difference between the two paths. One side ends quickly, but leaves behind a portion of matter that is separated. The other side is slower, more complex, but leaves no part standing outside the process. And when that temporary ecosystem has finished its work, when most of the soft tissue has been consumed, when the organisms have come and gone according to their biological schedule, you enter the stage where everything becomes less dramatic, visually, but far more important, scientifically. That is the stage of complete disintegration, where there is no longer a body in the ordinary sense, but only matter being redistributed into the larger cycles of the earth. The carbon, which once made up about 16 kilograms in your body, is no longer in muscle or tissue. Part of it was released early as carbon dioxide in the previous stages, especially when bacteria broke down organic compounds and released gas. The rest enters the soil in the form of organic compounds, where it becomes a nutrient source for soil microorganisms and plants. In temperate climates, most of a body's carbon can be returned to the soil and atmosphere within 1 to 5 years, depending on temperature, humidity, pH, and the biological activity of the surrounding environment. This means that in a relatively short time compared to geological scales, nearly all the carbon that once constituted you has been reintegrated into the global carbon cycle, where it can become part of a leaf, humus, or return to the atmosphere. Nitrogen, another important element in proteins and DNA. moves even faster. When nitrogen-containing compounds are broken down, bacteria convert them into ammonia and then continue through processes such as nitrification and denitrification to feed nitrogen into the nitrogen cycle. In many cases, within just a few months, most of the nitrogen from the body has become part of the soil or atmosphere, ready to be absorbed by plants or further transformed by other microorganisms. This shows an important feature of biological decomposition. It does not just break down structure, it reconnects matter to other living systems, almost immediately after the original structure collapses. But there is one part we have not fully addressed, and that is bone. As I said earlier about fire, bone is the most durable part of the body, and in natural decomposition, it is also the part that lasts the longest. However, longest here does not mean permanent. In moist soil, rich in microorganisms, and with suitable pH, bones begin to lose minerals over time. Bacteria and fungi can attack the remaining organic part in the bones, while chemical processes dissolve calcium phosphate into the soil. Depending on the environment, bones can disintegrate in about 5 to 10 years, sometimes faster in humid tropical conditions, or slower in dry, cold environments, or those lacking biological activity. But the important point is this: even the most durable part of the body is not outside this process. It does not need a mechanical grinder to turn it into powder. It does not need an additional processing step. It only needs time and the right environment, and eventually it too will be disassembled, ion by ion of calcium, phosphate group by phosphate group, until no bone structure remains. And when you put all of this together, you begin to see a complete picture. Carbon leaves within 1 to 5 years. Nitrogen joins the cycle in a few months. Hydrogen has long since become part of the water in the soil or air. Trace elements are absorbed by microorganisms and plants. And the bones, the final part, also disappear within a few years to a decade. No part of the body is kept outside the system. There is no remainder left separate. No material is locked in a state that does not participate in the larger cycle. Everything is redistributed, piece by piece, through biological and chemical pathways that have existed for billions of years. And that is why I can say with considerable certainty that bacteria, together with the entire ecosystem involved in this process, do not just break down the body. They do it almost completely, not in the sense that every atom disappears, but in the sense that every atom is returned to natural cycles without any part being kept as an isolated remnant. And if you remember what we saw with fire, you will begin to recognize the difference. Fire is faster, more impressive, and seems more thorough when you only look at time. But bacteria, although slower, go further. They do not just make you disappear. They ensure that nothing of you remains outside the continuous flow of matter and life. And if our question is about the completeness of decomposition, then this is the point where the answer begins to become much clearer. Fire, as we have seen, is extremely fast. You place a body in an environment with temperatures from 760 to 1150 degrees Celsius, and within 2 to 3 hours, most of the organic structure disappears. Carbon leaves as carbon dioxide. Hydrogen becomes water vapor. Nitrogen is released, and nearly the entire soft part of the body no longer exists in its original form. If you only measure by the clock, if you only care about how long until the body disappears, then fire has almost no rival. But that is precisely the trap of how the question is phrased. Because disappearing in form does not mean being completely disassembled in material terms. As we have seen, fire leaves behind a not insignificant portion in the form of minerals, about 2 to 3 kilograms, primarily calcium phosphate. And this portion does not automatically return to any biological cycle. It can sit quietly in an urn for decades, for hundreds of years, if no one intervenes. In other words, fire destroys quickly, but it stops halfway. It separates matter from the original structure, but it does not complete the reintegration of that matter into the larger system. In contrast, bacteria and the entire ecosystem involved in decomposition work in a completely different way. They do not have a clear endpoint in a few hours. They need time, days, weeks, months, sometimes years. But during that time, they do not just break down the structure, they process each part of the matter until no portion is left isolated. Carbon does not just leave the body. It enters the soil, enters plants, enters the atmosphere, and returns to the carbon cycle. Nitrogen is not just released, it joins the nitrogen cycle, becoming part of the soil, of microorganisms, of plants. Even bones, the most durable part, are not kept forever, but are gradually dissolved and dispersed into the environment. This leads to a difference in principle. Fire disperses matter. It pushes matter out of the original structure and delivers it into the environment in the form of gas or solid minerals. Bacteria reintegrate matter. They return each atom to active biological networks, where they can become part of new life almost immediately. And if you look at that from the perspective of physics and biology, you will see that this is not just a difference in speed, but a difference in the final goal of the process. One side optimizes the speed of destroying form. The other side optimizes the completeness of disassembling and redistributing matter. And when you understand that, you begin to see why the question, which is faster, is actually not the important question. The important question is which one goes all the way to the end of the process. Because if the goal is to break down the body completely, without leaving any part isolated, without keeping any structure outside the natural cycles, then speed is only a secondary factor. You can do it fast, but not completely, or slower, but more thoroughly. And everything we have gone through so far points to one very clear thing. Bacteria, although slower, go further than fire. They do not just make you disappear, they make you return as part of the system you always belong to. Therefore, if you are forced to choose a single criterion to compare these two paths, it cannot be speed. It must be the level of completeness. You might think we are only comparing two extremes. One side fire, with nearly instantaneous speed. The other side microorganisms in a natural environment, with a much slower pace. But in reality, there is a third path that is much more interesting, because it almost takes what is most effective in biology and accelerates it with technology, and that is composting, or more precisely human composting, the process of turning a body into soil through controlled microbial activity. What makes this method noteworthy is not just that it sounds unusual, but because it allows us to see very clearly what happens when you do not resist biology, as in traditional burial, do not burn the material, as in cremation, but actively design an environment so that biology works at its highest efficiency. In a well-controlled composting system, the body is placed in a chamber, along with carbon-rich organic materials, such as wood chips, straw, or alfalfa. And these materials do not just play a simple buffer role. They adjust the carbon to nitrogen ratio, maintain porosity in the material mass, create pathways for oxygen, and help the microbial community develop in the most optimal way. When bacteria and fungi begin to break down the body's tissues, they release energy in the form of heat, and if the conditions are controlled correctly, the temperature inside the compost mass can rise to about 55 to 70 degrees Celsius. This is an extremely important detail because that temperature level is much higher than body temperature, enough to strongly promote the activity of thermophilic microorganisms, but still far lower than cremation, meaning the entire process remains biological rather than burning. It is precisely at this temperature range that you have a very strange but very effective combination, hot enough to kill many pathogens, warm enough to accelerate biological reactions, and stable enough for bacteria, fungi, and their enzymes to continue disassembling organic molecules with astonishing efficiency. What happens inside the compost chamber is not a small-scale version of natural burial. It is an accelerated ecosystem. Proteins are broken down into peptides and then into amino acids. Lipids are cut into glycerol and fatty acids. DNA is broken down until it no longer has its original information structure. Soft tissue disappears first, then connective tissues, and finally, the more durable mineral parts, such as bones, are also gradually processed, thanks to heat, moisture, microbial activity, and a subsequent mechanical finishing step. The result is that instead of letting the entire process drag on for many years, as in a natural environment, you can complete most of the work in about 30 days. The figure of 30 days is not an exaggeration. It is the actual operating time of the first commercial systems, most notably Recompose, the company in the United States that helped bring this method out of theory and into legal practice. The state of Washington legalized human composting in 2019, becoming the first state to allow the method, and that is important, not only legally, but also in terms of public science. For the first time, a process that many people previously considered strange was recognized as a valid body disposition option because the data showed it was safe, controllable, and had very high biological efficiency. In the Recompose model, the body is placed in a sealed vessel along with organic material, rotated and aerated, according to a set procedure to ensure the microorganisms have sufficient oxygen and appropriate moisture. That means instead of letting nature decide everything randomly, humans are creating an organized version of the very decomposition process that bacteria have been doing for hundreds of millions of years. And the final result is what makes this method special. The entire body is converted into nutrient-rich soil, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a very specific physical sense. Carbon from the body becomes part of the organic matter in the soil. Nitrogen becomes a nutrient source for microorganisms and plants. Calcium and phosphorus from the bones are also returned to a form that can participate in the biological system instead of being kept in ashes or in an isolated environment. An adult body can produce about 1 cubic meter of soil, enough to fill a small pickup truck bed, and that soil is not symbolic soil. It is an environment rich in organic matter that can support plant growth. This shows you a profound difference between composting and cremation. Cremation processes the body very quickly, but most of the material is pushed into the atmosphere, and a mineral portion is kept as ashes. Composting is a little slower, but it leaves almost no parts separated from the biological cycle. Everything becomes soil, and soil is one of the central nodes of life on land. That is precisely why, if you evaluate according to the criterion we have built from the beginning, not what makes the body disappear fastest in front of human eyes, but what breaks down the body most completely in biological terms, what returns all the material to the living system without keeping any remnant in an isolated state, then composting is almost the strongest case we have. It does not just decompose you, it reconfigures you into a form that other life can use immediately. It is not just disintegration, it is controlled reintegration. And in that sense, if fire is a quick cut and natural decomposition is a slow disassembly, then composting is the accelerated and optimized version of that very disassembly. It takes everything microorganisms do well, keeps the thoroughness of the biological process, and then shortens the time to only about 1 month. That is why I say that if our question is, which method is the most complete in biological terms, then composting is not just a reasonable option. It is probably the strongest answer that current science can provide. If composting is the accelerated biological version of natural decomposition, then there is another method that goes in almost the opposite direction, without using fire, without relying entirely on living organisms, but using pure chemistry to disassemble the body in a very tightly controlled environment. And that is alkaline hydrolysis, sometimes called water cremation. Here, instead of placing the body in temperatures of thousands of degrees Celsius, as in cremation, the body is placed in a sealed stainless steel chamber containing a strong alkaline solution, usually potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide, then heated to about 150 degrees Celsius under high pressure to keep the water in liquid form. This creates an extremely reactive environment where the chemical bonds in the body are not broken by direct heat, as in fire, but are dissolved through alkaline hydrolysis reactions. Protein molecules, which are held by peptide bonds, are cut into smaller peptides and then into amino acids. Lipids are broken down into glycerol and fatty acids, then further transformed into simpler forms. DNA and RNA, the structures carrying genetic information, also no longer maintain their long chain form, but are cut into nucleotides and then further broken down into components that no longer carry the original biological meaning. The entire process does not take many days or weeks, but occurs in about 3 to 4 hours, equivalent to the time of a cremation session. But the mechanism is completely different. There is no flame, no burning, no strong oxidation that immediately releases carbon as gas. Instead, most of the organic matter is converted into a liquid solution containing dissolved compounds, such as amino acids, sugars, salts, and other small organic molecules. What is noteworthy is that this solution is basically sterile after the process, because the high temperature combined with the alkaline environment has killed bacteria and pathogens. The only part that remains in solid form after this process is bone, similar to cremation. But the bones here are not burned, but become softer and more brittle due to the loss of the organic part, and can be dried and then ground into powder. This creates an interesting point of comparison with fire. In cremation, most of your carbon leaves as carbon dioxide and contributes to the atmosphere immediately. In alkaline hydrolysis, carbon is not burned, but most of it remains in the liquid solution in the form of dissolved organic compounds. That means the path of material reintegration is different. Instead of going directly into the atmosphere, the matter enters the water system, where it can be processed in wastewater systems, or in some cases used as liquid fertilizer. This also relates directly to another factor we need to consider, which is energy. Cremation requires a very large amount of energy to maintain temperatures of thousands of degrees Celsius for many hours. Alkaline hydrolysis operates at a much lower temperature, about 150 degrees Celsius, and therefore consumes significantly less energy, often estimated at only about 1/7 that of traditional cremation. In addition, because there is no burning process, this method also does not produce carbon dioxide emissions at the equivalent level, nor does it emit substances such as dioxins or mercury from dental materials. But if we return to our original criterion, not the environment or energy, but the completeness of decomposition, then alkaline hydrolysis occupies a very interesting position between fire and composting. It is as fast as fire in terms of time, only a few hours, but similar to microbiology in that it breaks down the chemical structure thoroughly, turning most of the matter into a form that can rejoin the biological cycle. However, it still leaves a mineral portion that needs further processing, and the way the matter returns to the ecosystem depends on how that solution is handled afterward. This means it comes closer to completeness than fire, but still does not reach the level of direct and comprehensive integration like composting. And the very existence of this method shows one important thing. When you change the way you apply chemistry and biology to the body, you do not just change the speed of decomposition, you change the path that matter takes after the original structure disappears. And the point where everything starts to become truly interesting does not lie in which method is faster or slower, but in where your atoms go after the original structure is disassembled, because not all return paths are the same, and this is where intuition often leads you in the wrong direction. When you think about a body being broken down, you tend to imagine that as long as the bonds are cut, as long as the structure disappears, the final result is the same, but that is not true. The same carbon atom can leave your body through many different paths, and each path places it in a completely different position in the larger system of Earth. In cremation, most of your carbon becomes carbon dioxide almost immediately, flies into the atmosphere, and joins a vast reservoir of about 10 to the 44th gas molecules. There it can stay for many years, many decades, even longer, before being absorbed by plants through photosynthesis or dissolving into the oceans. This path is a form of very fast, very wide dispersal, but also very dilute, meaning the atoms are mixed into a system so large that the chance of them quickly returning to a specific living structure is relatively low. In contrast, when bacteria and the ecosystem participate in the decomposition process, carbon is not just released, it is transferred directly into the soil, into the biomass of microorganisms, into the bodies of insects, into plant roots. It does not have to go through a huge intermediate reservoir like the atmosphere before returning to life, but is almost immediately reintegrated into active biological networks. The same happens with nitrogen, with phosphorus, with calcium. In fire, they are released or kept in mineral form. In biology, they are fed straight into the nutrient cycle, where they can become part of another organism in a very short time. And this difference is not a minor detail. It touches directly on how the cycle of life operates. The biosphere is not just a collection of atoms existing somewhere. It is a dynamic network where matter is continuously reused, moving from one form to another, from one organism to another. When matter enters the atmosphere, it leaves the biological network for a certain period of time. When matter enters the soil and biomass, it stays within that network and continues to move inside it. Therefore, when we talk about returning to nature, the real question is not whether the atoms leave your body or not, because that certainly happens in every case. The question is what path they take to return, and where that path takes them. This is precisely the pivot point of the entire issue. Completeness. The level of completeness of decomposition is not only about breaking all the chemical bonds, but also about not leaving any part of the matter trapped outside the larger cycle of life. One process can break the structure very effectively, but send the matter into a state that participates little in biology for a long time. Another process can be slower, less visually impressive, but returns each atom back to the exact place where it can continue to participate in biological cycles almost immediately. When you look at it that way, our original question begins to change. It is no longer what destroys your body more powerfully, but becomes what returns your matter to the living system most fully. And when you rephrase the question like that, you begin to see that the difference between fire and bacteria is not just the difference between two ways of destruction, but the difference between two completely different paths of reintegration. One path of wide dispersal and slow return, and one path that keeps the matter inside the flow of life from the very beginning. To see the difference between dispersal and reintegration more clearly, I want to take you to a very specific calculation. Not philosophy, not metaphor, but a simple physics problem with a result that makes many people stop and think. Often called the problem of Caesar's last breath. An adult exchanges about a few liters of air in one inhalation or exhalation, and in that volume of air, there are approximately 10 to the 22nd gas molecules. This number sounds abstract, but it is simply the result of working with extremely small particles in a relatively large volume. Now, look at the entire atmosphere of Earth. The total number of gas molecules in the atmosphere is about 10 to the 44th. This is a huge number, but it is still finite. That means when a person exhales, the molecules in that breath do not disappear. They simply disperse, gradually mixing into the atmosphere through thermal motion, wind, convection, and diffusion. Over time, this mixing becomes nearly complete on a planetary scale. And here is where the calculation becomes interesting. If you take the number of molecules in one breath, about 10 to the 22nd, and compare it with the total number of molecules in the atmosphere, about 10 to the 44th, you will see that the probability of a specific molecule from one person's breath appearing in a molecule you inhale is extremely small, about 1 in 10 to the 22nd. But you do not inhale one molecule. You inhale about 10 to the 22nd molecules with each breath. When you multiply an extremely small probability by an extremely large number of trials, the average result is no longer small. It approaches 1. That means that in every breath you are inhaling right now, statistically speaking, there is a very high chance that you are inhaling at least one molecule that once belonged to the breath of a person who lived and died thousands of years ago. Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, anyone far enough in the past for their molecules to have had time to mix evenly into the atmosphere. All of them are part of this game. This is not a poetic image. It is a direct consequence of the numbers. Atoms and molecules do not disappear. They are only redistributed. But this is precisely the point that needs to be clearly distinguished, because many people, when hearing this, will think that it proves some form of deep biological connection between all of us. In reality, what it proves first is dispersal. The molecules have left the original body, been diluted into a huge system, and then mixed to the point that you can no longer trace their specific origin without using probability. They may enter your lungs, but that does not mean they immediately become part of a new biological structure. They may be exhaled again in the next breath. They may stay in the atmosphere longer. They may dissolve into the ocean. Their path back to life is indirect and depends on many intermediate steps. This is a perfect example of how fire and fast dispersal processes work at the atomic level. They take matter out of the original structure and throw it into a larger system where it exists, mixes, and only returns to the biological cycle when suitable conditions arise. This is completely different from what we have seen in biological decomposition and composting, where matter does not go through a wandering stage in a huge reservoir, but is delivered directly into living cycles. Therefore, Caesar's problem is not just an interesting curiosity. It is a very clear illustration of the difference between dispersing matter and reintegrating matter into biology. One side gives you global mixing, but a slow return to life. The other side gives you near immediate reuse, but within a specific biological scope. What you just saw with Caesar's breath is actually only a very intuitive manifestation of a much deeper principle. A principle that if you want to truly understand what is happening to the body when it is broken down, you cannot ignore, and that principle is tied to a name you may have heard, Ludwig Boltzmann. He is the one who provided the modern understanding of entropy, and if you have ever heard that entropy is the degree of disorder of a system, then that is only a shorthand, convenient, but not precise enough to grasp the essence. What Boltzmann really pointed out is this: for any physical system consisting of a very large number of particles, like your body, with trillions upon trillions of molecules, there are always countless ways to arrange those particles. Some arrangements are very special, very orderly, such as when the molecules are organized into cells, tissues, organs, and ultimately a conscious living body. But the number of ways for the particles to be in such a highly organized state is extremely small, compared to the number of ways they can exist in a less organized state. Boltzmann compressed this entire idea into a very short formula, S equals K times log W, where S is entropy, K is Boltzmann's constant, and W is the number of microscopic ways a macroscopic state can be realized. That means entropy is not a force pushing you toward chaos in a willful way, but a statistical consequence. There are far more ways for things to become dispersed than there are ways for them to maintain the tight structure they had at the beginning. When you look at a living body, you are looking at an extremely special configuration of matter, where trillions upon trillions of chemical reactions are continuously coordinated to maintain that order. Your body must expend energy all the time to resist this natural tendency, to keep proteins from breaking down, to keep cell membranes from rupturing, to maintain ion gradients, to repair DNA. And as soon as that energy supply stops, nothing is holding that structure anymore. There is no force that has to destroy you in an active sense. What happens is that less orderly configurations begin to dominate, simply because they are more probable. This is exactly how entropy relates directly to the decay of the body. Not because the universe wants you to decay, but because there are far too few ways for you to continue existing as an organized structure, compared to the countless ways for you to become a collection of dispersed molecules. And the important thing here is this: this is not a law in the absolute sense, like there are never any exceptions. At the microscopic level, the reverse processes can completely occur. In theory, the molecules in the air could rearrange themselves to recreate a structure like your body. No equation forbids that, but its probability is so small that you would have to wait a period of time, many times longer than the age of the universe, to have a chance of seeing it happen once. This is what Boltzmann really emphasized. Entropy is not a command. It is an overwhelmingly dominant probability that in practice we treat as a law. And when you apply that to our question, you begin to see more clearly why every path, whether fire, bacteria, composting, or hydrolysis, ultimately leads to the same trend: dispersion, disassembly, redistribution. The difference between them does not lie in whether there is decay or not, because that is inevitable, but in how they interact with that entropy process. Fire pushes the system very quickly toward a high entropy state, by supplying energy to break bonds immediately. Bacteria and the ecosystem do the same thing, but through a series of biochemical reactions, step by step, each step increasing the number of ways the system can exist. Composting optimizes that process. Alkaline hydrolysis applies chemistry to achieve a similar result in a short time, but all of them are just different paths leading to the same statistical destination. And when you understand this, our original question becomes sharper. It is not about what defeats entropy, because nothing can do that in the long run. Rather, it is about what works with entropy in the most complete way. What allows the system to reach the highest probability state without leaving behind parts that are delayed, isolated, or kept outside the common flow. And that is why understanding Boltzmann is not just understanding a formula on a tombstone, but understanding the deepest mechanism that explains why your body will decay, and why the way you decay can differ so much depending on the path you choose. And when you look at everything through the lens of entropy, as Boltzmann described it, you begin to see that our question is not only about the death of a body, but also about how matter moves between order and chaos, between structure and dispersion, between what you call life and what you call decay. Fire is the clearest example of pushing a system toward high entropy extremely quickly. You supply an enormous amount of energy in a very short time, enough to break nearly all the important chemical bonds at once. Complex molecules have no chance to go through many intermediate steps. They are separated directly into simpler components, such as carbon dioxide, water, and other gases. This is a sudden leap from a highly ordered state to a more dispersed state, where the atoms are no longer bound within the structure of cells, tissues, or organs. In that sense, fire is an extremely effective tool for increasing entropy rapidly. It does not negotiate with structure. It does not disassemble piece by piece. It only does one thing: pump energy into the system until the structure can no longer exist. But precisely because it does this too quickly, too decisively, it also reveals its own limits. It creates dispersion. Yes, but most of that dispersion occurs by pushing matter out of the body and into very large reservoirs, like the atmosphere, where the matter can take a very long time to return and participate in another living system. When carbon leaves the body as carbon dioxide, it has escaped the old structure, but it has not yet become a new structure. It is in an intermediate state, dispersed, mixed, waiting. Bacteria and the entire biological system involved in decomposition are different. They also increase entropy, and make no mistake about that. Biological decomposition is not against entropy, but is one of the clearest manifestations of entropy at work. But the way bacteria do this is much more subtle. They do not break everything in a single blow. They cut each bond, break down each macromolecule, metabolize each part of the matter through thousands or millions of small biochemical reactions. Each step increases the number of possible states of the system. That is, increases entropy, but at the same time creates conditions for that matter to be reorganized at another level. When the proteins in your body are cut into amino acids, entropy increases because the original structure is lost. But those amino acids do not go into undefined emptiness. They can be absorbed by a bacterium to build its own proteins. When lipids are broken down, energy is released, and the smaller molecules can enter new metabolic pathways. When DNA is chopped into fragments, the original information disappears, but the matter that made up the DNA does not disappear. It enters the next chemical cycle. This is a very important point. Bacteria increase the entropy of the body as an individual structure, but they simultaneously contribute to creating new living structures at a different scale. Some of the carbon that once belonged to you can become part of soil microorganisms. Some of the nitrogen that once lay in your muscles can become nutrients for plant roots. Some of the phosphorus from your bones can enter plant tissue or another organism afterward. In other words, bacteria do not just disassemble a system, they transfer the matter of that system to new living systems. Fire does not do that in the same step. Fire releases and disperses. Bacteria release and reconnect. And this difference is not a small matter. because it touches directly on how life operates on this planet. Life does not create new matter. It only borrows matter, arranges it temporarily into highly ordered structures, and then returns it. The question is how it is returned. Returned by throwing the matter into a huge reservoir where it has to wait to be reused, or returned directly into the flow of biological cycles, where it is taken up by other organisms almost immediately. When you look at it that way, you see that the difference between fire and bacteria is not just the difference between two ways of destruction, but the difference between two ways of handling matter after destruction. One side increases entropy by fast dispersion. The other side increases entropy by controlled disassembly, and at the same time allows reorganization at a new level. That is precisely why, if you ask which mechanism only makes the body lose its shape faster, fire wins too easily. But if you ask which mechanism goes further, deeper, more completely in returning all the matter of the body back to the dynamic network of life, then bacteria begin to emerge as the much stronger answer. They are not just agents of decomposition. They are the intermediary machinery between the death of one structure and the life of other structures. They are the bridge between entropy and biology. And that leads us to a conclusion that may sound contradictory at first, but is actually completely consistent with physics. Bacteria both destroy and recreate. They destroy you as an individual body, a specific pattern, a highly organized structure, but they recreate the flow of matter by returning your atoms to cycles that can create new life. In that sense, they do not stand on the side of death against life. They stand on the side of the continuity of living matter, where the death of one form is only the condition for other forms to appear. And that is why, when you look deeply enough, the boundary between destruction and recreation begins to disappear. With fire, the two are far apart. With bacteria, they are two sides of the same process. So if the matter in your body is constantly changing, then what exactly are you? You tend to think of yourself as a stable collection of atoms, as if your body is something assembled once and then kept the same. But biology does not work that way. In reality, over the course of 1 year, your body replaces about 98% of its atoms. This is not a symbolic number, but the result of your continuous exchange of matter with the environment. You inhale, exhale, eat, drink, excrete, and in each of those processes, atoms enter and leave your body. The cells in your gut renew in a few days. Skin cells flake off and are replaced. Molecules in the blood are recreated. Even bones, which you think are the most stable, are continuously restructured at the microscopic level. This means that your body today, in material terms, is not the same collection of atoms as your body a year ago. And if you push that thought further, you will realize that almost none of the atoms in your current body were there many years ago. Yet you are still you. Your memories still exist. Your sense of self remains continuous. This leads to a conclusion that may initially make you uncomfortable, but is completely consistent with what we have seen. Your identity does not depend on retaining specific atoms. It depends on the way those atoms are arranged, on the structure, on the information encoded in that organization. Your brain does not need to keep the same carbon atom throughout your life to store memories. It needs to maintain a structure, a network of connections between nerve cells, a pattern of activity. When the atoms are replaced, that structure is still maintained through biological processes. This is very similar to a stream of water in a river. The water flows continuously. Water molecules pass through and leave. But the river as a form, as a structure, still exists. You are not the water, you are the flow. And when you look at death from this perspective, its meaning also changes. Death is not the moment when your atoms leave, because they have already left and been replaced millions of times throughout your life. Death is the moment when the structure is no longer maintained, when the processes that keep that network functioning stop, when energy is no longer supplied, when bonds are no longer repaired, the structure begins to collapse. And when the structure collapses, the identity that depends on that structure also disappears. The atoms are still there, still exist, still continue to move in the cycles we have talked about, but what you call I is not those atoms. It is the way they are organized at a certain moment. This goes directly back to our question about fire and bacteria. Both mechanisms break down that structure. Both end the ability to maintain the pattern you call yourself. But the difference lies in what happens afterward. If you only think of yourself as atoms, then every path is the same, because the atoms continue to exist. But if you understand that you are a temporary information structure maintained in matter, then you begin to see that death is not the disappearance of matter, but the end of a specific pattern. And what happens to the matter afterward is no longer about whether you still exist or not, but about how that matter will be used in the next patterns. This changes the way you look at the entire process. It makes the original question less personal and more systemic. Not what happens to you, but what happens to the matter that once made you. And when you look at it that way, you begin to see that whether matter is dispersed into the atmosphere or reintegrated into the biological system is no longer a minor detail. It becomes part of a larger story about how patterns in the universe appear, exist for a short time, and then give way to other patterns. You are not a fixed collection of atoms. You are a temporary structure in that flow, and death is only the moment when that structure stops, while the flow continues. And when you have accepted that you yourself are not specific atoms, but a temporary structure of them, then death begins to appear under a very different perspective. No longer a mysterious disappearance, but a very specific, very physical, very measurable process of redistributing matter. No atom leaves reality. Nothing disappears in the absolute sense. Every atom in your body, from carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, to calcium, phosphorus, and the trace elements, continues to exist after the structure they once formed is no longer there. The only thing that changes is their position and the way they are arranged. A carbon atom that once lay in a protein molecule in your muscle can become part of carbon dioxide in the air, or part of organic matter in the soil, or part of another organism. A hydrogen atom that was once part of the water in your cells can become water vapor in the atmosphere, then condense into rain, then seep into the soil, then be absorbed by plant roots. A nitrogen atom that once lay in your DNA can enter the nitrogen cycle, become nitrate in the soil, then be used by plants to build new proteins. There is no interruption in this flow. There is only continuous transformation from one structure to another. When you look on a global scale, you begin to see that what you call your body is really only a temporary stopping point in a much larger cycle. The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, all operate independently of the existence of any individual, and you only participate in them for a short period of time. Throughout your life, you have continuously taken matter from the environment, organized it into a highly ordered structure, and then used energy to maintain that structure. When you die, that process reverses. The matter is no longer held in that structure, and it begins to return to the cycles from which it came. This means that death is not an event separate from nature. It is an indispensable part of the way nature operates. One beautiful. Then that kubias poplity. If there were no such redistribution, if matter were locked permanently in structures that had lost function, then new life could not form. Each generation of organisms exists based on matter released from previous generations. You eat food, and that food is created from soil, water, air, all containing matter that was once part of other organisms. You breathe air, containing molecules that have passed through countless bodies before you. You drink water that has traveled through oceans, clouds, rivers, and organisms for millions of years. When you die, you do not leave that system. You continue to participate in it, but no longer as a separate structure, but as part of the flow of matter. And this links directly to what we have seen about the methods of decomposition. Some methods slow this redistribution process by keeping matter in an isolated state for a long time. Some methods accelerate it by pushing matter into the atmosphere. Some methods, such as composting or natural biological decomposition, keep the matter within the ecosystem and allow it to be reused almost immediately. But no matter the path, the final point remains the same. Every atom returns to the environment. There are no exceptions. No remainder exists permanently outside these cycles. When you look at it that way, the question of death begins to lose its absoluteness. It is no longer the boundary between existence and non-existence. It is the transition between two states of participating in the same system. Before, you were a concentrated structure of matter. Afterward, you are a dispersion of that same matter in other structures. And when you look broadly enough, you realize that you do not leave the ecosystem. You become it in a very direct, very physical sense. Your atoms go into the soil, into water, into air, into the bodies of other organisms, and continue the cycle they have participated in for billions of years. This is not a metaphor. It is the way matter actually operates on this planet. When you look at everything that way, the story begins to shift very clearly from what destroys your body to how your body returns to the larger system. And this shift in perspective is not a language game. It is a real change in the way the problem is understood. At first, our question sounded simple: fire or bacteria? Which one destroys you more completely? But after everything we have gone through, you can see that the word destroy is no longer precise enough. Nothing is destroyed in the absolute sense. The structure is disassembled, yes, but the matter still exists and continues to participate in other processes. So what is really being decided is not whether you are destroyed or not, but in what path you rejoin life. And here the choice of body disposition method is no longer a minor technical detail. It becomes a factor that directly affects how your matter returns to the ecosystem. If you choose a method that keeps the body in an isolated state for decades or centuries, you are slowing that matter's redistribution process. If you choose cremation, you are pushing most of the matter into the atmosphere quickly, where it will take time to return to the biological cycle. If you choose biological methods such as natural decomposition or composting, you are allowing your matter to be delivered directly into the soil, into microorganisms, into trees, almost immediately. This is not a moral judgment, but a measurable difference in physical and biological terms. And when you realize that, the question of completeness begins to become deeper. Completeness in what sense? Is it breaking all the bonds as quickly as possible? Or is it ensuring that no part of the matter is separated from the cycles from which life is sustained? You can achieve the first with fire. You can achieve the second with microbiology. And those two things do not completely overlap. This leads to a point where science and philosophy begin to touch each other. Science can tell you exactly what happens to the atoms, to the molecules, to the energy. It can give you the numbers, the times, the mechanisms. It can tell you that one method returns matter to the biological cycle faster or keeps it in an isolated state longer. But science by itself does not answer how you should care about that. That is where you begin to have to think about the meaning of completeness. If you see yourself as a temporary information structure, as we have said, then what may matter is not holding on to the matter, but the way that matter continues its journey. If you look more broadly, you can see that all life on this planet depends on matter being continuously reused. There is no new source of matter added to the system at the scale that life needs. Everything is recycled. In that context, whether you return to the ecosystem quickly or slowly, directly or indirectly, is not just your own concern, but part of a larger flow of which you have always been a part. And that is why this story, even though it began as a technical question about fire and bacteria, ultimately becomes a much broader question. It is a question about how you understand your place in the material world, about whether you see yourself as a separate entity or as part of a continuous system. It is science, because every argument here is based on physics, chemistry, and biology. But it is also philosophy, because the way you interpret those facts depends on how you see yourself. So fire or bacteria, which one really breaks down your body more completely, is no longer a vague question, because you now have in your hands the entire scientific framework to look straight at it. You have seen how fire works, a process based on high temperature, supplying enough energy to break chemical bonds almost immediately, converting most of the matter into gas in just a few hours. There is no doubt about that. If you measure by time, if you only ask what makes the body disappear fastest, then fire is the clear answer. It is fast, it is decisive. It does not leave many traces of the original shape. But you have also seen its limits. It does not handle all the matter in the same way. It leaves behind the mineral portion. It disperses most of the matter into the atmosphere, and it does not ensure that every atom is immediately returned to biological cycles. A part of you after passing through fire, will remain in a separated state or in a large reservoir from which the return to life is indirect and time-consuming. In contrast, bacteria do not have the drama of fire. There is no extreme temperature, no burst of flame moment you can point to, but they have something fire does not: the ability to disassemble the structure from the inside, step by step, and more importantly, the ability to return that matter to the ecosystem directly. You have seen them start from inside your body, already there before you died, waiting for the system that maintained order to stop, so they could switch roles from symbiosis to decomposition. You have seen them create the stages of decay, from autolysis, gas production, to the participation of insects and soil microorganisms, until nearly the entire body is converted into simpler compounds. You have seen carbon enter the soil and atmosphere within a few years, nitrogen join the cycle in a few months, and even bones do not exist permanently, but are gradually dissolved and reintegrated. This means that bacteria do not just break down the body, they complete the process in the strongest sense, leaving no part of the matter isolated from the natural cycles. When you place these two paths side by side, with a clear criterion, not speed, but the level of completeness of disassembling and redistributing matter, the answer begins to become hard to avoid. Fire is faster, but not complete. Bacteria are slower, but more thorough, and not just thorough in breaking down the structure, but more effective in reintegrating the matter into the ecosystem. This is the key point. If you only care about ending a structure as quickly as possible, fire is the appropriate tool. But if you care about not leaving any part of the matter separated from the flow of life, if you care about the entire body being returned to the biological cycles from which life continues, then bacteria are the mechanism that does that better. And this brings us back to the criterion we have built throughout the entire story. Completeness is more important than speed. Speed can be impressive. It is easy to see, easy to measure, easy to understand. But completeness is what determines what really happens to your matter in the long term. It determines whether every atom is returned to the system, or whether a part of it will be kept, delayed, or placed outside the common flow. And when you understand that, the original question is no longer a choice between two methods, but a way to understand more deeply how matter and life are connected. Fire gives you speed. Bacteria give you completeness. And if you are forced to choose which factor is more important scientifically, then the answer does not lie in what is fastest, but in what goes all the way to the end of the process. What I have done here is not to deliver a final verdict for you, not to say there is a correct choice and all the other choices are wrong, but only to put the scientific facts on the table and let you see them as clearly as possible. Physics, chemistry, and biology do not care about our emotions about death. They do not give advice. They do not tell you what you should do. They only describe what will happen to the matter, to the energy, to the structure you temporarily call your body. They tell you that every atom will continue to exist, that every structure will eventually be disassembled, that entropy will increase, not because it must in the sense of a command, but because that is the overwhelmingly probable state. They show you that there are different paths from a living structure to a more dispersed state, and each path has its own characteristics in terms of speed, mechanism, and how the matter is reintegrated into the larger system. But the point where science stops is exactly where human choice begins. You can look at all these facts and still ask a very personal question. What does this mean for me? You may care about how quickly everything happens, or you may care about how your matter is used afterward. You may not care about any of that. And that is also a choice. What is important is that you understand that what you choose does not change the laws of physics, but it changes the specific path that your matter takes within those laws. So if you want to rephrase the original question one last time, you can put it in a different way, a clearer way, less prone to misunderstanding. Do you want to disappear as quickly as possible in terms of shape? Or do you want to become part of the next processes of life in the most direct way? There is no universal answer to that question, because it depends on how you see yourself and your place in the world. But no matter how you answer, one thing that everything we have said points out very clearly is this: You do not leave the universe. There is no moment when your atoms disappear from the system. There is no absolute boundary where you go out. What happens is that your role changes. For a period of time, you are a concentrated structure, a highly organized pattern that can think, feel, and ask questions about itself. Then that structure stops, and the atoms continue their journey in other structures. You are no longer a person, but your matter does not disappear. It becomes part of the soil, of the air, of the water, of other organisms. In a very real, very physical sense, you do not leave the story. You simply are no longer the main character in the next part. And perhaps that is the most honest way to look at this entire issue. Not as an absolute end, but as a change in the role that your matter plays in a system that existed long before you and will continue long after you. If you want to continue exploring questions that change the way you look at yourself and the universe, please subscribe to the channel right now. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next journey.